Hello, everyone, and welcome. Antonio Arellano here. Today, we're going to be talking about the impact of this last legislative session in Texas. An absolutely historic legislative session. We saw a break in quorum. We saw some of the most draconian pieces of legislation pass the Texas legislature. And now these pieces of legislation are now laws, and they're impacting the day-to-day lives of millions of Texans. To help me break down the impact of the Texas Ledge, I'm joined today by the state representative from Round Rock, Mr. James Talarico. James, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you, Antonio?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy that you're going to be able to join us, really digest and process everything that happened in the past legislative session. I mean, are you still reeling from that endless Texas Ledge session?
Yeah, I mean, I think 10 months was the amount of time that we were at the Capitol legislating. And for those who maybe are unfamiliar with the Texas legislature, we're only usually in session for about 4 months every other year. And so this year has been very strange because we were in session for so long with repeated special sessions, one after the other, into the summer and into the fall. So it's been unusual. And then, the fact that so many of these, conservative red meat issues were thrown into our lap by our governor also made this different from past legislative sessions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you point out one very important issue, which is red meat legislation. A lot of the legislation that we saw come out of the Texas Ledge this past session was almost feeding the Republican base in the state the raw meat of discrimination, of oppression, and really rallying the worst of folks and the worst of the values that I don't believe Texas really stands for. So let's break it down. So many of these pieces of legislation, like I said, are already impacting the day-to-day lives of so many folks. The first half of the pieces of legislation that were passed during the first regular session went into effect in September. Some others went into effect immediately, and we are expecting others to go into effect in the coming months. One that really caused a lot of tension in Texas was permitless carry. So we have House Bill 1927, which allows Texans of the ages of 21 and older to carry handguns without training or licenses. How did this happen on the heels of the worst Mexican-American shooting in El Paso in American history?
Yeah, we've seen over the past decade, Republicans continually chip away at gun safety. And we saw it with campus carry, and now we're seeing it with permitless carry, which means that anybody in Texas can carry a handgun without training and without a license. What's ironic about this is that law enforcement officials and law enforcement leaders around our state were vocally opposed to this legislation. They came to the Capitol. Sheriffs and police chiefs came into our offices and told us why this was a dangerous idea and why it would make their jobs harder. And for all of their talk of backing the blue and supporting law enforcement, Republicans in the state legislature ignored their professional advice and passed permitless carry anyway. So it's both a dangerous piece of policy, and it's also, I think, an important reminder that Republicans are not interested in supporting law enforcement. They're only interested in passing their radical ideological agenda that's going to win them Republican primary votes.
We need to do much better to make sure that we are addressing gun violence in the state and also preventing any further violence from occurring. You bring up a great point. Some law enforcement officers testified against this bill, saying that it's going to make their job harder, more dangerous. How do we, instead of focusing on expanding the access willingly to anybody to carry a gun, how do we go about actual gun safety in the state of Texas?
Yeah, the experts on this issue have told us that the ways to reduce and curb gun violence in our state and our country are to take some common sense approaches to gun safety. So universal background checks, for instance, which is supported by overwhelming majorities of Texans and of Americans, is a great way to ensure that those who shouldn't have a gun don't get a gun. Republicans, Democrats, and independents all agree that universal background checks is a good idea. And yet, because of the influence of the NRA and the gun lobby, we can't seem to pass some of these gun safety measures in Texas or nationally, even as you mentioned, Antonio, after some horrific mass shootings across the country and here in Texas, including in El Paso. And so, I think if we're going to approach the issue of gun safety, and if we're going to ever make progress on it, it's going to be through campaign finance reform, which is reducing the influence of the gun lobby and of groups like the NRA within our campaigns, because you have to go to the root of some of these issues. And oftentimes, who has influence in elections, who's able to donate to lawmakers, that influence is what policy outcomes you see in legislative sessions. So although gun safety and campaign finance reform don't always seem like they're related, in fact they're inextricably linked, and you're not going to be able to get gun safety until you tackle the issue of campaign finance.
Well, you bring up the NRA, and rightfully so. The NRA has now been, in some ways, really booted out of their state in New York and have made it clear that they're aiming to make Texas their new home. Does that make Texas ground zero for this fight?
Absolutely. As in so many cases, Texas is at the front line of so many of these battles, and gun safety is no exception. And the NRA exerts incredible influence over our political process nationally and statewide here in Texas. And so many of my Republican colleagues on the House floor will tell me privately that they think permitless carry is a crazy idea, right? They think it's dangerous. They think it's bad public policy, but they will still vote for it because of the influence of the NRA and because of the influence of some of these far right, Republican primary organizations and leaders. And so, again, when you're talking about some of these more radical policy outcomes, it's important to look at the system overall that we're working within. So thinking about campaign finance reform, also thinking about our primary system, thinking about redistricting, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, and how do these things incentivize elected officials in both parties to take certain actions? Because, Antonio, as you know, you've worked in politics for a long time, you can replace the individual personalities, but until you change the system itself, you're not going to see different policy outcomes, because someone is just going to replace me and someone's just going to replace Dan Patrick if you get rid of us. So if you want to see politicians act better, you've got to give them different incentives within the system itself.
That's a great thing to highlight there, Representative. Let's move on to another really important issue, the abortion ban in Texas. Texas has made national news because of SB 8, which seeks to outright ban abortion in the state. So many women really having to grapple with this new health risk that this presents to their lives. Let's talk about that. How did Texas begin to move the needle on an abortion ban, and how has the state been able to move forward without any real ramifications?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to clarify. The Republicans will say that they're giving a 6 weeks within a pregnancy to be able to have an abortion. But what most people don't realize, especially those of us who are male like you and I, Antonio, is that women oftentimes don't know they're even pregnant at that point in the pregnancy. And so it is, like you said, virtually a ban on abortion. And so, this Texas is unfortunately, again, at the front lines of this battle for reproductive justice in this country. And this is an attack on the moral agency of women and the ability to control their own bodies. This is kind of the logical conclusion of the pro-life argument, which is, if you really do consider abortion to be murder, then you have no other choice but to ban abortion outright and to persecute and maybe even prosecute women who choose to have an abortion. And so what's happening now politically is you see some voters in Texas who maybe are kind of in the middle of this issue, who maybe are sympathetic to some of the pro-life arguments, are suddenly having to grapple with the ramifications, with the implications of that argument, and it's making a lot of people uncomfortable. The one thing you didn't mention, Antonio, was the bounties that are put on the heads of women who who choose to have an abortion, and the ban on anyone assisting a woman in seeking an abortion. I mean, this is kind of like, Handmaid's Tale, right? You're starting to see this government control over women and the decisions they make about their own bodies, and it's frightening to a lot of people who maybe even didn't consider themselves pro-choice, but are suddenly seeing the real world consequences of the pro-life movement.
The decision now of how to deal with this is ultimately in the hands of the Supreme Court. We've heard the opening oral arguments to this case that's made it all the way to the highest court in the land. If the law is upheld by a conservative-leaning Supreme Court, what are you prepared to do in the state of Texas to fight against this and grant women their right to choose?
Here in Texas, we have limited options because of the lack of majorities for Democrats in both the state House and the state Senate. So I think where our attention really needs to be is our national capital in Washington, D.C., and focusing on persuading federal lawmakers to write Roe v. Wade into law and to ensure that we can protect a woman's right to choose in every state, blue states and red states like Texas, where that right is under assault. And there's really no excuse for our Democratic colleagues in Washington, D.C. for not taking this important legislative action. This is true for abortion. It's also true for voting rights. We can't afford to wait any longer for our colleagues in Congress to act. And they've got to do something, or we're going to start to see our fundamental constitutional rights, both our right to vote and our right to an abortion, slowly chipped away by Republican majorities in state houses across the country.
You're absolutely right. And moving on now to another topic that I think is really, really imperative to discuss, and you showed so much leadership on, was the election reform bill that recently passed at the Texas legislature. This is one that garnered national attention, really created a lot of discomfort in terms of conversations being had at the state level, going all the way to a historic quorum break this legislative session. Talk to me about the ramifications of limiting access to people with language barriers, limiting access to 24-hour polling locations, drive-through polling locations that were so successful. Why did the state decide to move in a different direction?
Yeah, so one, I think we should start by recognizing that there's not a problem here. You're going to hear Republican lawmakers talk about voter fraud, but we know that voter fraud doesn't exist. Either the Republican Secretary of State here in Texas said that the 2020 election was safe and secure. I agree with our Republican Secretary of State that our elections are absolutely secure, and there's no reason for these new measures to be put in place. So if we recognize there's not a problem, then we have to ask ourselves, why are Republicans pursuing some of these restrictions on voting? Why are they trying to make voting harder? And you pointed it exactly, which is they're trying to prevent certain populations from being able to access the ballot box. And that includes people of color, it includes young people, it includes people with disabilities, and people who don't speak English. Those constituencies historically have supported Democrats in elections, both local, state, and national. And so the Republican Party is essentially disenfranchising Texans for their own partisan political gain. It's a power grab. And this is where it gets really dangerous, because we can have disagreements on abortion, we can have disagreements on guns, but we can't disagree about democracy itself. If we lose that, then we no longer have the ability to conduct these debates in a free and fair democratic system. And so that's why my colleagues and I took the extraordinary step of breaking quorum, not once, but twice in the past year, to send a clear message, not only to our Republican colleagues, but to the rest of the country, that this is a real crisis in Texas, that our very democracy is at risk. And if we don't do something at the federal level to reverse it, then we are possibly going to see our democracy wither on the vine.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to that historic quorum break, that was almost like a last resort, and it seems to have always been historically utilized in the state legislature as last-ditch effort to try to get some bipartisanship or some compromise to happen. Is this type of leadership, this bold and fearless stance that the Texas Democrats took, something that we can expect moving forward?
I hope so. As you mentioned, quorum break is kind of the last resort. It's the last option in our legislative toolkit. There are many ways to either stop, kill, or weaken bad legislation. You can use the rules. You may remember that I called a point of order on the quote unquote critical race theory bill in the regular session. That's a way that you can kill legislation. You can also use your relationships in the legislature to persuade your colleagues to make certain concessions to water down key provisions of a bill. And then, of course, there's direct organizing. There's bringing folks to the Capitol to pressure lawmakers. There's having folks email and call their legislators to make their opinions clear. Those are all the tactics we want to use first. But when all of those fail, then we have no other option than to take the extraordinary step of breaking quorum, which for those who are still new to Texas politics, a quorum is the number of legislators that's necessary to conduct business. And so by walking off the floor, if enough of us do that, then we prevent the state house as a chamber from conducting any further business, which is what we did at the end of the regular in May, and also in the first special session in July. I will say, and I think this is important for everyone to understand, typically a quorum break, because it is so disruptive, because it essentially halts the democratic process. The only reason we would do that is if the democratic process itself is at risk. So really a quorum break is only reserved for the most egregious abuses of power, which, as you mentioned, include the mid-decade redistricting back in 2003, and then this voter suppression bill in 2021. There are a lot of bad bills that get introduced and that get passed in the legislature, a lot of things I disagree with. We don't break quorum over those issues because they don't rise to the level of threatening our very foundation of our political system.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And if I recall correctly, Representative, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you were one of the few Democrats to come back a little bit earlier than others, and there seems to be some internal tension. Can you walk us through or give us an inside look as to what led to that decision, and what is the relationship now within the Democratic side of the Texas Legislative Party?
Yeah, all of our colleagues within the Democratic caucus were united when we broke quorum at the beginning of the first special session. About 57 of us went to Washington, D.C. to prevent the voter suppression bill from passing in that first regular. And we knew that we had to manage expectations because, as we said from the beginning, there was no real option and no real path to kill this voter suppression bill in Texas. The only path, the only option we had was to persuade our federal counterparts in Congress and in the U.S. Senate to pass federal voting rights legislation that could override the voter suppression bill in Texas. And so we said from the beginning that we were living on borrowed time and that we couldn't hold out forever. And so to manage those expectations, we all agreed that we would come back at the beginning of August when the first special session ended. This quorum break was an important form of direct action to raise awareness, to ring the alarm bells, and to lobby Congress to act. All of those things were accomplished by our quorum break. We accomplished every goal that we articulated at the beginning of that quorum bust. And so once those goals were accomplished, once we had raised this issue for the entire country, once we had rallied congressional members to take action, once we had put this kind of at the top of the congressional priority list, we felt that it was time to head back home to Texas and be able to get back to work on other business. There's always going to be disagreement among colleagues about the best approach to do that. Some wanted to stay out a little longer. Some wanted to try to ask for different things. Those of us who came back used our return to weaken the voter suppression bill in some important ways by reducing the penalties that were put in place for those who violate some of the new rules, and ensuring that these poll watchers are now going to be required to receive some type of training. So those were key concessions that we were able to earn. But like I said, the real way to stop this bill from taking effect is to have Congress do their job and pass federal voting rights legislation, which I'm so hopeful that they'll do.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw this be a really contentious legislative session. For folks like us who are not in the Capitol day in and day out, can you walk us through what was the tone and in those days, and did that shift towards the end of the session? Are you hopeful about returning to the Capitol and be able to get stuff done? Seems like there was a lot of gridlock.
Yeah, we should recognize there's a difference between a regular legislative session and a special legislative session. In a regular, every member, Democrat or Republican, are able to work on their bills, able to push policy forward through the process, usually through bipartisan legislating. In a special, you are only legislating on topics that the governor has set. And as you know, we have a radical far right demagogue in the governor's office, and so Greg Abbott has used these specials to push far right, radical, extreme red meat issues like bullying trans children, like restricting abortion even further, like censoring social media content. All of these things are being pushed by our governor so that he can solidify his position within the Republican primary electorate. And so those specials can be really demoralizing for lawmakers, especially for Democrats, because we're not able to work on, some of the issues that we care about. In the regular session, Antonio, you'll remember that I passed historic legislation to cap the out-of-pocket costs for insulin. I passed a sweeping bill to improve early childhood education. I passed Javier Ambler's law, which will hold police accountable across the state of Texas. And so those were important progressive wins in the regular session. Those are not possible in a special. And so these repeated special sessions really take a toll on all lawmakers, but especially our Democratic minority.
You're absolutely right. And I'm glad that you outlined those differences for sure. Let's talk about House Bill 1535, medical marijuana expansion. People with any form of cancer or post-traumatic stress disorder now have access to low levels of THC cannabis for medical purposes. Does this open the door a little bit wider for legal marijuana in Texas?
Yeah, I sure hope so. I'm happy with the little bit of progress we've made, but it still is not enough. Right. I proposed legislation this year that would legalize marijuana fully and would expunge past marijuana convictions. And my bill goes further and uses the new revenue generated by legalized marijuana to fund early childhood education across the state of Texas. That's the kind of approach that I think most Texans want to see, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And yet it's something that's not making progress in the legislature because of folks like our Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, who are putting their own ideology ahead of what's best for Texans. So I'm hopeful that in the next election in 2022, Texans in all political parties will make their opinions known to lawmakers that they support legal marijuana and using that revenue to make our state even stronger.
I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? It'll boost the economy. It'll bring some justice to a broken criminal justice system. Yeah. Why dragging the ball on this one, Texas?
Yeah, I completely agree. The only thing I can gather, and I should say, there are Republicans in the state house who have supported our efforts to decriminalize marijuana, and we've passed some pretty significant legislation in the past two sessions since I've been here to make progress on this issue in the House. But they keep dying in the Senate, where the Lieutenant Governor presides in that chamber. And so, from what I can gather, the Lieutenant Governor is more concerned about his fortunes in the Republican primary, and so feels he needs to cater to an outdated social conservative view that marijuana is somehow dangerous when we know it's not. So I hope that will change when we elect Mike Collier to be our next Lieutenant Governor in November of next year. But we desperately need to make more progress on this issue for all Texans.
You're absolutely right. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I did want to talk about the social studies curriculum changes that occurred under House Bill 3979, which limit teachers from discussing current events and systemic racism in class, as well as the Project 1619, which talks about slavery. Talk to me a little bit about where this war on education comes from.
Yeah, as you know, Antonio, I led the fight on this issue on the House floor, in the regular and in the special. And I did that because I'm one of the only educators who serves in the state house. Although education is the biggest part of our state budget, the biggest part of our policymaking portfolio, there are only a handful of us in the state house who have classroom experience. I was a middle school teacher before I ran for office and got elected. And so I was personally offended by this bill. One, because it micromanages teachers. It is founded on a fundamental distrust of educators, and politicians thinking they can do our job better than we can. And then it is also lying to our students, and it is disempowering our Black and brown students, who are the majority in Texas public schools and will be the ones to lead this state into the future. And I know as an educator that any strong classroom is built on trust. It's built on honesty between the educator and the student. And this bill, to whitewash our social studies curricula and to muzzle teachers, was designed to undermine that trust and that honesty. And that's a real disservice to our students, who deserve to know all of our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because only when they are taught the truth can they take ownership of this democracy of ours and improve it going forward. And so I thought this bill was immoral. I thought it was offensive. And I have told educators across our state since that bill has passed that I believe they have a moral obligation to disobey that law and to teach true, honest, and accurate social studies in their classrooms.
Yeah, it's a definitely something that has put teachers and educators in the state in a really difficult position. And I believe and I agree with you that it's imperative that we teach a true and honest, authentic version of our history in a way that fully encompasses the lived experiences of everybody who shares that history. I wish we could talk about all of them, but there were over 600. I'm going to give you a minute here to just talk a little bit about the biggest wins that you think actually came out of this last legislative session.
Yeah, I was incredibly proud of my team here at the Capitol. I want to make sure I shout them out because they helped us usher through some of the biggest progressive wins in the past legislative session. I mentioned the cap on insulin copays, which will make insulin available to those with diabetes across our state. I mentioned the early childhood bill that we passed, which is going to improve the quality of early childhood education across Texas in the years to come, especially for low-income kids. As you know, Antonio, early childhood is possibly the most important thing we can do to reduce economic disparities in this state. 85% of brain development occurs before the age of 4, and we have to do more in that early stage of life for our kids. And so our bill is going to do that. And then the last one I want to mention is Javier Ambler's Law, which is named after one of our neighbors here in Central Texas, an unarmed Black man who was killed by Williamson County Sheriff's deputies, and whose murder was filmed by a reality TV show crew for other people's entertainment. The bill we passed in his name and in his honor will ban any police department, any law enforcement agency in Texas from partnering or contracting with reality TV shows ever again. And so these were big wins for progressives in Texas. And they're even more impressive because they happen within a Republican majority. And so I want folks to know that there are good, strong progressive legislators and staff members here in the Capitol fighting the good fight and winning, even in a difficult environment.
You're absolutely right. And it's an uphill battle, but I think it's one worth taking. And Texas is at a tipping point. Don't underestimate the power of young voters that are coming together to drive forward a real transformation of the state. Last question, and I say this with all due respect. What was it like to be drawn out of your district?
Not fun. Yeah, no. Our district was destroyed in the gerrymandering process in the last 2 weeks, and it feels a little lonely because I'm one of the only Democrats who was drawn out of their seat. But that's because I have been one of the loudest critics on the House floor, whether it's on the critical race theory bill, or whether it's on the anti-trans bill. I have not held back in committee or on the floor. I cause trouble for Republicans. I ask hard questions. I hold them accountable, and I pass some of the most progressive legislation in the Capitol. And so, the powers that be saw that as a threat and decided to try to get rid of me by destroying my seat. Thankfully, folks in our community have asked me to run in the neighboring district, House District 50, which is coincidentally where I grew up. And so I've been proud to start my campaign there, and I'll be running for re-election in that district in this upcoming primary.
Well, hopefully we get a lot more of you being loud and fearless on the floor of the Texas legislature. Thank you so much for your time, Representative. We really appreciate it. Folks, Texas is at a tipping point, and we're on the way to the midterms. Make sure that you're getting informed and staying engaged with Texas politics. From Lubbock, Texas, I want to say good night and talk to you soon.